Mabel Whitfield did not flinch. Not when Duncan set down his fork and looked at her across the length of the Hargrove table, with the patient kindness of a man who has decided to be gentle about something embarrassing. Not when the conversation around them went briefly, politely quiet. Not when she felt 11 pairs of eyes settle on her face, with the careful attention of people witnessing something they will discuss later, once the port is poured and the ladies have left the room. She kept her hands in her lap. She looked at her husband. "My wife," Duncan said to the table, and his voice carried the measured warmth of a man who believed he was being generous, "has a remarkable eye for our household accounts. I've always said so. But the mechanics of industrial supply chains, I'm afraid, are rather beyond a lady's education." He smiled at her then, not cruelly, not dismissively, which would have been easier to carry, fondly. The way a man smiled at a child who had guessed wrong at a parlor game and was too young yet to understand the sting of it. 2 seats down, Cyril Paget laughed, soft and comfortable. "Hargrove didn't hire you for your wife's arithmetic, Duncan." Quiet, self-congratulatory laughter moved around the table. Mabel lifted her water glass. She took a sip. She set it down. She had noticed a discrepancy in the supply figures Paget had distributed before dinner. Not a guess, not a feeling, but a specific numerical impossibility in the third-quarter ledger projections he'd handed around on cream-colored cardstock while the other men talked over them without reading them. She had pointed it out to Duncan quietly, leaning close, her voice below the level of the table conversation. He had patted her hand. She had not been wrong. She knew she had not been wrong. She knew it the way she had always known certain things, quietly and without drama, in the specific part of her mind that worked without asking her permission. The soup arrived. The dinner continued. Mabel spoke when she was spoken to, and said nothing she hadn't said before in some form, and no one noticed, which was the way these evenings always went, and she had long since stopped expecting them to go any other way. She was 26 years old. She had been married to Duncan Whitfield for 4 years, an arrangement made when her father's textile concern was failing, and the Whitfield name meant solvency. The marriage was polite. It was orderly. Duncan was not a cruel man, not even unkind, simply a man who had assembled his life in a particular order and could not imagine why any of it would need revising. She had been slotted into that order at the appropriate interval, and she had fit it, because she had been raised to fit things, and because fitting things had seemed, at 22, like the most practical form of survival available to her. She understood now that there was a difference between fitting and belonging, and that she had spent 4 years confusing one for the other. The carriage home was quiet. Duncan talked about Paget's expansion plan, about the Chicago mill contract, about the men at the table. He talked the way he always talked in carriages, without pauses, without questions, without apparent awareness that she might have something to add to any of it. She looked out the window at the November dark and thought about the third-quarter ledger. There was something in those numbers that did not fit. Roberta Fenn came to call 3 days later. Mabel was not expecting her. People who called on Mabel were either neighbors making social rounds or colleagues' wives making rounds on their husband's behalf. Roberta Fenn was neither. She was 61 years old, twice widowed, and had managed the Fenn printing company alone since her second husband died without a male heir and left her the whole of it, debts, presses, and difficult employees included. She had been running it profitably for 11 years. Philadelphia's business community had spent that decade deciding whether to be offended by this or simply incorporate it as an inexplicable local fact, the way you incorporated the weather. She had been at the Hargrove dinner. Mabel remembered her at the far end of the table, quiet in the manner of people who are doing the most watching. "I won't take long," Roberta said when Mabel's housekeeper had shown her in. She looked around the front parlor with the brief, assessing glance of a woman who took inventory of rooms out of long habit. "Is there somewhere your staff won't hover?" They sat in the small back study, where Duncan kept his overflow correspondence. It was, Mabel thought, the room in the house where she felt most like herself, though she had never had occasion to say so to anyone. Roberta did not offer condolences for the dinner. She did not mention it at all, which Mabel found, somewhat to her own surprise, deeply relieving. "You saw something in those figures," Roberta said. Mabel looked at her. "I was watching your face, not when your husband spoke, before that. When you'd been reading the ledger sheets Paget passed around." She tilted her head slightly. "What was it?" For a moment Mabel was quiet. She had grown careful about saying what she saw. 4 years of marriage to Duncan had made her careful about a great many things, none of them by intention. He was not the sort of man who set out to diminish anyone. He simply could not conceive of her as a person whose observations carried the same weight as his own. And that failure of imagination, repeated across 4 years of small moments, had accumulated into something she could now measure with considerable precision. The materials cost from the Lowell supplier, Mabel said, listed at 6 cents per unit in the third quarter projection. And? In January, Paget negotiated the Lowell contract himself. Duncan told me about it at the time because he was pleased. They'd secured 4 cents per unit. She paused. The difference over that volume, across 3 quarters, is not a rounding error. Roberta went very still. No, she said after a moment. It is not. She looked at Mabel with the particular attention of someone revising a prior estimate upward. Have you told Duncan? I tried to at dinner. A beat of silence. I imagine you did, Roberta said. She uncrossed and recrossed her ankles. Come to my office on Thursday. I want you to look at something. The something turned out to be 10 years of Fen printing ledgers, which Roberta set on the desk in front of Mabel on Thursday morning, and then watched her work through for an hour without speaking. When Mabel looked up, Roberta was watching her with an expression that was precise and contained, and, underneath its precision, something that was almost satisfaction. You read that faster than my last bookkeeper, Roberta said. I've been reading my father's factory accounts since I was 16. He trusted me with them more than he probably should have. A pause. He trusted me because I was better at it than he was, and he was honest enough to know it. And after you married? Duncan keeps his business accounts at the office. A silence. Roberta turned to the window. I want you to look at public records. Supplier contracts registered with the city commercial office. Incorporation filings. She turned back. The kind of thing anyone could find if they knew what to look for and cared enough to look. Mabel studied her. Why are you doing this? Roberta considered the question honestly. Because I watched a woman see something real at a dinner table, she said, and then watched the room teach her that she hadn't. I have been that woman. I know what it costs when you let the room win. The practical register returned. Also, if Cyril Paget is doing what your arithmetic suggests, the Whitfield company will collapse inside 18 months. That affects a great many people who have nothing to do with Duncan's dinner table manners. Mabel was quiet for a moment. Tell me where the commercial records office is, she said. She went 4 times in 3 weeks. She told Duncan she was calling on friends. This was not entirely untrue. Roberta Fenn had become, in the particular unannounced and unsentimental way of women, who had better things to do than perform closeness, something that was beginning to resemble one. What she found in the records was worse than she had expected, and it accumulated the way damage always did, in small, specific pieces that added up to something large and patient and deliberate. Paget had not renegotiated the Lowell contract just once. He had renegotiated it 3 times over 3 years, each time driving the unit price lower, each time recording the original price in the Whitfield company books. The difference, 2 cents per unit across 5 product lines, at the volume Whitfield and Paget moved, had been flowing into a subsidiary company. Paget had incorporated in Delaware in 1903, under a name that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. 3 years. She sat with that for 2 weeks without rushing anything. She was not an impulsive woman. She never had been. She talked to Roberta. She talked once to a quiet bookkeeper named Calvin Mercer, who worked in Roberta's office, and who received her questions with the steady respect of a man who understood she was not asking to be educated but to verify. Is this enough, she asked, at the end of their second conversation, for an investor to ask questions? He looked at the documents she had assembled, copies of public records, her own calculations, Paget's original figures compared against the commercial filings. He was quiet for a long moment. Yes, more than enough. She went home. She spent 3 evenings writing careful factual letters that contained nothing she could not support from what she had found in the public record. She sent them to 3 of the Whitfield and Paget investors. Not the largest, the most thorough. Then she waited, and while she waited, she worked. She pulled every household account going back to the year of her marriage. She found the kind of drift that accumulated in a household where no one was truly paying attention. Not extravagance, just waste, small and consistent and invisible. She corrected it methodically. She renegotiated the coal supplier contract herself. which required 2 conversations and the willingness to let a man believe he was explaining something she already knew. The new rate was 14% lower. Duncan noticed in the way he noticed things that disrupted his prior understanding of how the house operated. Briefly, with mild puzzlement, and then not again. The first sign came from Calvin Mercer, a note with a single line. Leland Morse has been to the commercial office twice this week. Asks about Paget specifically. Leland Morse was the company's largest independent investor. He was also, Mabel had learned, the kind of man who did his own arithmetic. She sat with the note for a morning. She did not feel triumph. What she felt was quieter and steadier than that. The feeling of a situation, beginning to move in the direction of the truth, which was a different thing from victory entirely. Duncan came to her study on a Tuesday evening in December. She was at the desk. He was dressed well, as always, but there was something in the way he stood in the doorway that she had not seen before, an absence of certainty that normally occupied the space around him like a piece of furniture. He looked like himself, but lighter, as if something foundational had been moved. I had a meeting with Leland Morse today, he said. She set down her pen. He had questions about Paget's supplier records. He had documentation. His voice was level and careful, and she could hear what it cost to keep it that way. Someone had shared public records with him, records I hadn't seen. He looked at her directly. Mabel. She waited. Was this you? She had thought about how to answer this. She had thought about the Hargrove dinner, the fondness in his voice, the table's laughter, the water glass in her hand. I shared public records with investors who had the right to know what they contained, she said. I invented nothing. I stated nothing I could not document. The third quarter figures. The Lowell contract, 3 years of it. He went very still. She watched him arrive at the same conclusion she had arrived at 3 weeks ago, in the way of a man who had not wanted to look, and was now being made to, and could not look away. How long have you known? He asked. Since the Hargrove dinner. A silence. Outside, a carriage moved along the street. I tried to tell you, she said, not with anger. She was careful about that. In the carriage, on the way there, at the table. He said nothing. He was doing the other arithmetic now, not the financial kind. Paget has been taking 2 cents per unit, on 5 product lines for 3 years, she said. The money is in a Delaware subsidiary. The Chicago expansion is running on margins that cannot sustain what the books show. If Morse and the other investors don't know what they're holding, the company does not survive. She paused. Neither do the 37 men who work the presses. The silence was long. You should bring Calvin Mercer in, she said. He works for Roberta Fenn. He knows where the rest of the documentation is. Duncan looked at her. She saw it arrive on his face slowly. Not shame, not yet, but the specific preceding moment when a man understood that the thing he had dismissed had been, all along, the most consequential thing in the room. I told the table, he said carefully, that commerce was beyond your sphere. You did. He was quiet. I was wrong, he said. Not performing it, not framing it, simply saying it, the way a man said something when there was nothing left to arrange it into anything else. Yes, she said, you were. Cyril Paget resigned from Whitfield and Paget in January. He did not admit fraud. He did not need to. Morse's attorney had subpoenaed the Delaware records, and the records had answered every remaining question, without Paget having to answer any of them. He left Philadelphia in February, quietly, without performance, heading toward family in Ohio, toward a life where the shape of what he'd done had not yet arrived. The company survived, not comfortably. The Chicago expansion was restructured. 2 smaller investors pulled back. The coming years would require discipline the prior years had not. But solvent. Calvin Mercer's final accounting showed that without Mabel's early detection, the fraud would have come to light in any case, 6 to 8 months out. But at the point of collapse rather than the point of correction. The difference was the company itself. The difference was 37 men. She received this information through Roberta, which was how she received most things now. Roberta set a piece of paper on the desk between them on a Wednesday morning in March. What is this? Mabel asked. A proposal. I intend to retire in 2 years. I need someone who can read a ledger without blinking, negotiate a supplier contract without apologizing for the negotiation, and understand what a business looks like from the inside before it becomes visible from the outside. She looked at Mabel directly. I want to bring you in as junior partner. Mabel was quiet. I'm married. I'm aware. My husband. Your husband's company is alive because of you, Roberta said, plainly and without drama. I suspect once you have a direct conversation with him, he will find a way to accommodate this. Men generally do when they understand the arithmetic. A pause. And if he doesn't? She left it there, where it could be whatever Mabel needed it to be. She had the conversation with Duncan that evening. She had thought about it all day. In the careful, deliberate way she thought about everything now, turning it over, looking at what was underneath, deciding what she needed and what she was, and was not willing to trade. She had been wrong, at 22, about almost everything except the arithmetic. She had not known how to want things plainly, how to say this is what I see, and I am not mistaken, and hold the line when someone looked at her with patient fondness, and changed the subject. She had learned that. She had learned it in a records office on Chestnut Street, in a back room with a bookkeeper, who answered her questions straight, in the press room of a printing company, owned by a woman, who had never once looked at her with pity. Duncan listened to what she proposed. He was quiet for longer than she expected. 2 days a week, he said finally, at Fenn's company. To start. Another silence. I didn't know you wanted this, he said slowly, as if testing the sentence for accuracy. I didn't ask. No, she said, you didn't. He looked at his hands. She had found, in 4 years of marriage to this man, that she could not make herself dislike him entirely, which had been inconvenient when dislike would have been simpler. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had arranged the world according to the only pattern he had been given, and who had never, until now, had reason to examine the pattern itself. I should have asked, he said. She believed him. Not completely, not with the easy trust she had once given, but with the calibrated belief of a woman who had learned to read evidence, and had been reading him carefully across all these months. You can start now, she said. He looked up, something shifted in his face. What do you need? He asked. She told him. She began at Fenn Printing in April. She wore a different coat on those days, good dark wool, purchased with money from the renegotiated household accounts, which she had decided was hers to spend on something that felt correct. Roberta introduced her to the staff on the first morning with the brisk efficiency she brought to all introductions. This is Mrs. Whitfield. She reads numbers better than most men I've worked with and will not be managed, which is why I brought her here. A pause. Questions on business matters go to her. Questions on everything else to me. The press foreman, Griggs, who had worked at Fenn Printing for 15 years, nodded once. The nod of a man who was registering what he saw and deciding it was the kind of thing worth being registered. By June she had renegotiated the paper supplier contract. By August she had identified a client segment. Roberta had not pursued and written a proposal for it that Roberta read twice before looking up and saying, without ceremony, I should have seen this years ago. It was, Mabel would understand later, one of the finest things Roberta Fenn ever said to her. Duncan came to the press room once, in July, at the end of her workday. He stood in the doorway and watched her finish a conversation with Griggs about the quarterly press schedule, and when she turned and saw him there, she did not know what to expect from his face. What she found was simpler than anything she'd braced for. He was watching her the way a person watched something they had underestimated, and were now, carefully and without fanfare, revising. He offered his arm for the walk home. She took it. They walked without speaking for half a block, and then he said, Griggs told me they've never been ahead on the quarterly schedule before. He told you that? He stopped me on the way in. Duncan paused. He seemed to think I should know. She looked at the street ahead of them. Griggs is a practical man. He is, Duncan said. They kept walking. The letter from the Philadelphia Commercial Association arrived in November. It was addressed to Mrs. Mabel Whitfield. Her name first, which was not the way correspondence had ever been addressed to her in her life. It came on the recommendation of Leland Morse, who had apparently told the exposition committee that the financial detection work, which saved a mid-sized Philadelphia company from collapse, had originated with a woman who had, in his words, a clear eye, and the willingness to be right when it was inconvenient. The committee wanted to know if she would be willing to present at the March exposition on the mechanics of reading supplier contracts against public records, on what to look for, and where to look, and why it mattered that someone did. She read the letter twice. She set it on the desk. She thought about the Hargrove dinner. The soup arriving. 11 faces arranging themselves into the particular expression of people who have heard something they can ignore. She thought about the first morning in the commercial records office, asking the clerk where incorporation filings were kept, and the mildly bewildered way he had looked at her, as if her question had arrived from an unexpected direction. She thought about Roberta walking into her parlor and asking, without preamble, "What was it you saw?" She picked up her pen. She wrote back to the committee with the measured, direct courtesy of a woman who had arrived at her own worth by the hard work of proving it to herself first, and who found, in receiving this particular confirmation, not surprise, but something quieter. The feeling of a truth that had been true for a long time, finally being spoken aloud in a room that was ready to hear it. She said yes. She sealed the letter. She set it with the outgoing correspondence and opened her accounts book because there was still a great deal of work to do. There always was. She had never in all her life been more glad of that.